Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to another monthly edition of a Kobo Live Q&A. Really happy this month to be talking all about audiobooks with Karen White. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
And I can see some comments already in the chat where people are telling us where they're coming from. So do tell us where you're coming from. We have somebody from Scotland, from New York City, and from a smoky Pittsburgh. It is also very smoky in Toronto.
Very smoky here. Yesterday we couldn't see the CN Tower at all. It was very smoky.
Yeah, today is a bit better. Yesterday I could smell the smoke. It seems to have cleared up a little bit. But yeah, it is definitely feeling it in the air. So thanks for tuning in, even though we have all of these things happening in the world.
Best to hide. Just hide.
Exactly.
Hide and tune into the Kobo Writing Life live.
Yeah, play your violins while Rome is burning. Just go for it.
Nice. Well, we wanted to talk to kind of an audiobook expert, sort of fairy godmother, as Laura was just kind of referring to Karen about, because June represents Audiobook Month. Oh yeah, that's like you just have a tiara handily available.
Ready.
Yeah. For certain questions, I'll put it back on.
Love that.
But June version of the thinking hat.
Exactly. June represents Audiobook Month for us here at Kobo and in the general world, I believe. We have a lot of good promotions going on. If you are interested in getting any audiobooks, you can browse kobo.com to see them. And there's also a lot of great audio features in various different Kobo Plus. So if Kobo Plus is available in your region, you can also access that as well. And just to kind of give a top tip to everyone, a lot of our latest Kobo devices actually have audiobook integration included, which people might not know. So with your Kobo e-reader, you can sync up to your Bluetooth headphones and Bluetooth headphones, I said that, and speakers, where you can listen to your audiobooks all in one place, or you can use our free apps. We don't have a separate audio app or anything like that. And then as from the author perspective, you can upload audiobooks in your Kobo Writing Life account. If you don't see that as an option, you can shoot the team an email at writinglife@kobo.com and we'll enable this for you. But yes, that is enough of my little spiel. I'm delighted to kind of introduce Karen, who has narrated over 400 audiobooks over 20 years. She's a multiple winner of Earphones Awards, Publishers Weekly, and Listening Journal Starred Reviews, and is a 3-time Audie finalist, which is really the big boys of the audiobook industry, is the Audies. So in addition to helping others find avid listeners for their audiobooks, she publishes on her own as Karen Gray, and her audiobooks have been an Audiophile Earphones winner, an Independent Audiobook Award, and Sultry Listener Award finalist. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Good to see you guys again.
Thanks. And so if anyone isn't really familiar with your background or anything, could you talk to us a little bit how you got your start in audio?
Sure. Well, so I am a trained actor. I have a master's in performance, and I was a theater actor and I did radio drama. I forgot about that. And film and TV and commercials. And then when I got married and was thinking about having kids and not really excited about dragging those children around to auditions in Los Angeles, which is where we were at the time, I happened to meet someone who said, "Oh, I have a friend who does audiobooks, and I think you would be so good at that," because I've always been a reader. And so I looked into it, and the only job I could get in Los Angeles was as an editor of the actual recording. And the person said to me, do you know how to use Pro Tools? And I said, yes. I did not. I didn't even know what it was. But I learned very quickly. And I actually was pretty terrible at being an editor, but I was good enough to get hired as sort of a casting / producer / project manager when Books on Tape opened in Los Angeles, when they opened a studio. And then from there, I started directing and then started narrating. So I kind of have done all the jobs, and also was really active in the Audiobook Publishers Association, as well as the Actors Union, serving on committees. So then I also learned a lot about what other people do and how to support my fellow narrators and authors and publishers, especially on the PR and events committee. And So once I decided to publish my own writing, I quickly realized that there was some things that were similar to publishing in audio and some things that were extremely dissimilar. So that's how I ended up starting my audiobook marketing and consulting company, because I realized there were things that I could teach other people.
And because you were such a prolific narrator, what made you kind of decide to make the jump to become an author and start the writing side, I guess?
I think, like a lot of people, the year 2016 made me really evaluate my life. Just things changed in America somehow, really abruptly. And so I had always been a storyteller, obviously. And in my theater life, I had done a lot of what's sort of called devising, which is creating work mostly with other people, but I'd never sat down and written anything. So I just started. And I wrote the book that everyone, I think every writer has, that no one will ever read. It is, deep in the bowels of my computer. And then that was a middle grade book about girls and soccer, which I don't play, so I'm not quite sure why I did that. But then I switched gears and decided, because I had met so many romance authors, and I was so impressed by what savvy businesswomen they were, as well as supportive of each other. So I'd narrated a lot of romance. So I decided to try writing romance, and it was a steep learning curve. My first book, I didn't know what a trope was. I learned by the second book. So, it's been, I think the big impulse though, is that I get bored easily and I like to learn new things. So I have been learning a lot.
Was it different narrating your own book? Like, did that feel different?
Yes, the stakes were weirdly higher. The actual delivery, about half the time, was obviously much easier, because I had written that first book, especially because I had worked, sort of workshopped that and sent it out and put it in contests to get feedback. So I had rewritten that book multiple times, and still there were parts of it that I was like, as I was reading them, I was like, oh, I hate this. Why did I write this like this? And rewriting it as I went. So, but I also only recorded half of my first book. The other half of it, the male point of view, was recorded by Joe Arden, who is a dear friend of mine. So, and I haven't recorded any of my other books. Each book has a new pair of narrators.
Nice. And how did you kind of talked a little bit about the start of your career there, but how did you become a narrator? Like, if somebody was looking to do that right now, I'm sure maybe it has changed a little bit, but what were the kind of steps involved in that?
Now there are many people who run literally like audiobook narration schools, or workshops, all that kind of thing, both in LA and New York, and ones that you can access via Zoom. Back then, that did not exist. Almost everyone was narrating either in New York, but we started this LA studio, and there was another one in LA and one up in Ashland, Oregon, spread around the country, in Michigan. But it was really learn by doing back then. The expectation has always been that a narrator is a trained actor, and most people who are casting and producing find that theater actors have the best transfer, that's not the word, but theater actors do well in audiobooks, because we are used to taking a character on the whole journey. And I myself had happened to have done multiple one-person shows, as well as theater pieces where I played multiple characters. So that also is a help. There are a lot of people now who are moving from other voiceover fields. And so I think what's really challenging for them is the narrative. Like, they're used to doing voices and playing characters, but they're not used to telling the story and taking the reader along on that part of the journey. And so when I started, to answer your question, actually, there was always a director. There was always a director and or an engineer in the actual room with me on the other side of the glass. So that even though I was learning by doing, there was guidance. Now, the majority of narrators are recording on their own, which is fine to self-direct if you have the experience. So what a lot of people do are hire, they'll study with a coach or in a program. And a lot of people will hire a director or an engineer for their first few books anyway, to have someone else paying attention to the product. So you can just be present in the performance, because it takes a while to find that balance where, to me, the most important part of any performance, of any actor's performance, is that you are present. You are in the moment as you're speaking, so that the words feel like your own, feel like you are discovering them in the moment. But when you're an audiobook narrator, self-directing, you have to pay attention. Like, you hopefully can't hear it, but my air conditioner just went on, and a little part of my brain just went, air conditioner on, because I'm so used to listening for those things. And I think earlier there was a frog outside. I mean, I'm just attuned to these things. And then another part of your brain has to pay attention to the words to make sure you say them in the correct order, which, your brain can make those little substitutions. So however you do it, it's a process. And to sort of jump over to the author side of things, that's why one of my big recommendations is make sure that you are not part of a new narrator's learning process. When you are hiring a narrator, you want to make sure that for your books, that narrator has, I don't know why, but 20 under their belts. It seems like a good number to me, that they have sort of worked out the bugs in their system. They are not thinking about what they're doing because they've done it enough.
Nice. That's a good kind of segue into, we have a question here. And if you have any questions, anyone that's viewing, you can drop them in the chat. I'll try and pull them as we go through, or get to them at the end as best we can. But a question here about, on average, how long does it take to transition a book to an audiobook, which I think is a great question, because I feel roughly the answer is a lot longer than we all think it does. Can you speak to this a little?
Well, it takes a narrator an average of 2 to 4 hours in the studio and that does not count. That does not include preparation, the time that the narrator takes to read your book and take notes. But in the studio, it's 2 to 4 hours of time to get the final hour of the recording. So if your book's 8 hours long, that narrator was in their recording booth for anywhere from 16 to 30 some hours, right? Then someone, usually a person's called a proofer, will take the recording and listen to it while reading your text and mark the text and flag the recording for any time they made a mistake. And then those are returned to the narrator. They're called pickups or corrections. And the narrator has to re-record those sections. Then all that goes to an editor, which is another skill set and really craft all unto itself. And not just any old sound editor. I mean, someone who's working in radio or music does not have the skills to edit an audiobook. You really have to have a whole awareness of what the listener's expectations are, also what the audiobook retailers' expectations are in terms of sound quality, all the things that, honestly, that's the part I don't understand at all. It's magic. So that's going to take that person probably another couple of weeks to put all that together. So there is no sort of definite, it's going to take this long. I would say it's going to take at least a month, maybe 3 weeks, depending on the audiobook narrator's schedule and how long your book is. But the thing that really takes a long time is getting onto that audiobook narrator schedule. Depending on how popular they are, how busy they are, they might be booked. I mean, there are narrators who are booked a year out, many who are booked 6 months out or several months out. So that is one thing that I recommend, unless you are somebody who writes and is willing to release months after you have written a book. I don't personally, my books, I'm a slow writer, and I can't even think about the audiobook until the book is done. So I release them separately. A lot of people feel like it's important to release everything the same time. But to me, because I'm a slow writer, that's a whole new release. That's a whole new marketing thing that I can talk about. So to me, it's worth putting off the release to wait for the narrators that I want. But that is what's really going to take the time. And you can't give the narrators a book before you send it to your proofer, because they must have the absolute final book. Because if you send them changes after they've recorded, you have to pay extra for those pickups, versus if they make the mistake, those are included in the recording, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say a little quick tip as well for any authors whose books are on Kobo. If you're curious about how long your book is, because sometimes it's hard to tell, if you go to the book's product page, we actually have an estimate of how many hours it would be to read. So it'll say like your book is 4 to 5 hours. So that might help you sort of gauge an estimate of maybe eventually down the line with the audiobook production. So that's just my little tip there.
Another tip is to take your word count and divide it by 9,000. And that gives you the average length. Some narrators are going to be slower, some are going to be faster, and it depends on the pacing of your book. But that'll give you an overall idea.
That's good to know. And you mentioned before looking for an audiobook narrator who has done at least 20 books before. Is there anything else that authors should keep in mind when they're looking for a narrator for their book?
My primary strategy is to take the time to find a narrator who is in this part of their career, who is on the way up, and not just overall, but in your genre. So the first thing I suggest people do is, if you are not an audiobook listener, if you are not a fan, and then you want to find somebody in your corner, whether it's a relative or a best friend or someone who loves your books. So you maybe not your mother, but maybe it's one of your street team who is also an audiobook fan, to help you with this process. But my first recommendation is to do that. Then to look at your comps, to look at books in your sub or sub genre, depending on what you're writing, and make a list of narrators that writers who write in your subgenre are already using. And then don't just listen to the 5-minute sample. If you can, obviously get it from the library, or maybe on your Kobo Plus subscription, but listen to some of their books, or have your person listen to some of their books. Read the reviews, because there are things that are important in some genres that are not as important in other genres. For instance, in cozy mystery and in fantasy, doing believable but sort of exaggerated or to the level of the book character voices is really important. I mean, we were talking about Gandalf before we started recording. If Gandalf or some wizard is in your book, or some orc or some other monster, you want to have the right kind of voice for that. Or, the little busybody next door, and those kind of voices in a cozy mystery, you want to have those be fun and believable. In romance, listeners are really picky about men doing women's voices and women doing men's voices, and they have to be able to do it believably, and not everybody can do it. Not everyone has developed that skill. So go to your comps, make a list, listen to those narrators, and then rather than putting your book out for auditions on the services that are provided for that, my recommendation is find your list of maybe 10, 20 narrators that you're interested in, and then go and find them and reach out to them directly. Most narrators will be able to either produce the audiobook for you or refer you to a production company that can do it. And that is the most economic way to do it. I'm sure there's more, there's a lot more that goes into that, but that's kind of my overarching strategy.
And no, those are great tips because the wrong narrator can really pull a reader out of the book. So you want to make sure you have someone who's, like you said, doing all those voices properly and not in a cheesy way. That's really taking you out of it.
Yeah. And also you want to be age appropriate, culturally appropriate. Honestly, one reason why I only did one book of my books, and I've actually retired from narrating for, I don't know if you can even hear my voice. I have some, I can't do it anymore. I can't do 6 hours of recording anymore, but I'm sound older than a 20-year-old. So you want to make sure you have someone who sounds the right age. And all actors think, well, I can play all the parts, but when it's the primary, and you can, many of them can play a child and an 80-year-old, but for the primary voice, whether it's first or third person, you want it to be age, race, gender, whatever appropriate.
That's a great point. And before we started recording, you mentioned some people think you need to kind of simplify your writing for a narrator. And you said you don't agree with that. So can you expand on that a little bit and tell me why that's not the case?
There are people out there talking about changing your book to make it more audiobook friendly. And I think there's some wisdom behind that. For instance, you could pay attention a little bit to how often you're using voice tags. If you are overusing voice tags, there is a technique when you're recording where you say the line of dialogue, she said, and then we went on to da 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 da. So you're dropping that voice tag a little bit in tone, and it's like a throwaway line on stage. But if you've got he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said, back and forth, then it does become a little bit annoying in the ear. So I know in my writing, I'm really particular. If it is clear who is speaking, I can use a bit of sort of stage direction, movement direction, blocking to indicate who's speaking, then I do minimize my speech tags, but or dialogue tags. But I think that having dialogue that sings, that is, that is full of emotion and that moves the plot forward, all those things is important. But dumbing the text down, I think a narrator would be so sad to know that had happened, because we are actors. Most of us, like I said, are stage actors. My background is in Shakespeare. So we have spent years and years learning how to bring text and language alive. We love words. So I don't think that's necessary. I do agree with reading your words aloud, because that helps you find things that are, that are wonky, that don't really flow, that you have repetition of words, which is really annoying to read when you're narrating. But I would say the most important thing is to make sure that your book is tightly paced and that you have a strong emotional arc. All those things that you want to do to create a well-edited, well-written book anyway. That's what I'd say focus on. Don't focus on making it easier to read.
Thanks. You answered a question that came up here from KL, was talking about the author's editing aspect. So you were sort of saying there is that the narrator will take the lead from the text. So are you ever not narrating direct? Is that what you're saying, that you're not including all of the he said, she said, because it's going, or do you narrate every single word on the page?
We narrate every single word on the page, because there are, at least the major publishers, I remember there was a sort of dictate. When I started, oh my goodness, there was no there was no QC. There was very little proofing. We, it was like, if you got it close, good enough. It was crazy what we got away with back then. But I remember a point where one of the major publishers said they were starting to focus on selling books as language learning tools. So selling the print and the audiobook together outside of the country. So they were like, it must be exactly right. If it's you can't say every single word must be exactly right. Now, here's my pro tip. If you are an indie author and you are in control of your ebook and your print book, especially if you do your own formatting, what I do is when the audiobook is recorded, I get the list of corrections from my editor and I go through them. And if the way the narrator did it is better than what I wrote, like they made a mistake, but they made it flow better, it just sounded better, especially in dialogue, I go back and I change the ebook and the print book. And I don't make them redo it. I find that is it's an extra level of editing, that I get. And I usually end up making like 10 changes a book. And it is literally things like to the. But and audio and narrators may also catch your typos that somebody else didn't catch.
That's interesting. You often wouldn't think about using audio to change the ebook. It would always be sort of presumed the other way around. So I feel like that's an interesting insight.
Well, many of us are constantly uploading new versions of our books anyway to change the back matter or and things like that. So I just feel like it makes the book better. Somebody who bought the print book are they really going to get upset if they're reading my print book and they hear a difference? No, I don't think they are. So
I have a couple of questions coming in here. So a comment saying, I listen to audiobooks daily. The pet peeve is the mispronunciation of words or accents with areas they're unfamiliar with. So how much research goes into like narrating a book? Or is this all kind of just part of the narrator's job? It's implied that you're doing this work as well.
That's sort of this is one of my other big recommendations for authors. When you're preparing, when you send the book to the narrator, after you've cast the narrator and you have heard them in an audition, perhaps hear some male-female dialogue if it's romance, recording in some of your more important accents, depending on where it's set. You want to hear all those things in your audition process. But then what I highly recommend is, especially if you keep a good Bible, is giving your narrator the absolute final version of the text, which, like I said, you could always change, but you want them to have the final version of the text. As much information as you have already gathered about the characters in one place, like in your Bible. I have a series and where characters are coming back. It's a friend group series. So, and I have different narrators on each book, which I don't necessarily recommend. But if you do that, then I keep also a voice bank so that every book, the main characters, there are little samples of those. And then with each new book, I have people add on to those so that everybody who comes after can listen to those voices and match those. The other big thing I recommend is giving your narrators a pronunciation list. So if you have written a fantasy and you've made up words, you must do this. You must provide them with a list of pronunciations the way you want, because obviously they cannot research that. But if you've also written something in a real place that you are familiar with, give them a copy of it. For instance, one of my books set in Boston, there's a part called Monotony Rocks. And I neglected to do that in the very first edition that it was in a collection. And it drove me insane because they said it metonymy or something like that instead of monotony. So, or maybe I've said it wrong. Anyway, as much as you can, prepare them ahead of time. But that said, it is the narrator's job to do this research. The tough thing is, many names are pronounced in multiple ways. So if you wanted a particular way, then you should let them know before they record.
It's like Tara or Tara. I get asked that all the
Exactly.
time. And I'm like, oh, I don't really mind. We just have different accents. But I know if there was a book, you couldn't flip between the two. So you'd have to advise. Like,
I remember there was one author who wrote mysteries, and I'm a little OCD about these things. So I sent her a list of names, and even if it was Tara or Tara, things like that. And she wrote me back the nicest email saying, I am so appreciative that you did this, because I name all my characters up after my friends, and they love it when they hear themselves referred to in the book. And if it's wrong, that would upset them.
Oh, that's a good point. I have a question here from Kate, who is asking advice on using an accent for non-English speaking characters, as her book's set in Japan, main character is American, but there are some Japanese characters. So how should she go about the audiobook process for this?
I want to know, is the book, okay, the main character is American. Okay. If the main character is American, then definitely the narrative, whether it's first or third person, should be in a what we call general American accent. And this depends a little bit on whether it's first or third person. But if that, you want to have the accents come from the point of view of the person who is experiencing the story, right? So if it's first person and the Japanese characters are speaking American to the American, she's going to hear an accent, right? However, the exception to that would be, I think of it in terms of, say, a Chekhov play that has been translated into English, and every character in that play is speaking English. They are not going to have a Russian accent, right? Because we have moved the whole world in our imagination into this bubble of English speaking. We have sort of all agreeing to accept that they're speaking Russian, they're in Russia, but that's not what we're hearing. Does that make sense? It's the thing of suspension of disbelief. So you want to think about the suspension of disbelief and what will keep that the most intact.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's like that movie, The Death of Stalin, as you mentioned, the Russian side, where all of the actors just use their actual speaking voices, whether it's British or American, even though they are all playing Russian people. So I guess it depends on what the want is from the audiobook, right?
Right. I think that the choice I've seen made, which I find jarring, is when the book is third person and it's set in Britain, in the UK, Scotland, or Ireland, or England, and one of the main characters is American and another is British, and most narrators can flip back and forth between basic accents quite easily, but then the narrative is in an American accent. That can be really jarring. So it's what, again, will uphold the suspension of disbelief and not take you out of the book.
Nice. Just Richard says, great information so far. So I wanted to share that. And then also this sort of jumps into, so this question here, does KWL have a narrator base for hire? We don't. We just take the finished files. So we're not actually helping with the production of the audio. So you can just publish them through KWL. But it does lead me into wanting to talk to you about home cooked books and what you do with Karen with this company. So you have an audiobooks consulting company. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Yes. So I actually did a consult with someone yesterday, and I literally said the words to her, because she was coming to me for a marketing consultation, and she was frustrated with how her whole working with distributors and the casting of the book had gone. And I said, I wish you'd called me 9 months ago, because I could have saved you literally months of work, because as you probably have experienced, if you're a wide author, every single distributor does things slightly differently. I mean, all the keywords are slightly different. The categories are slightly different. But yeah, how you load things is slightly different. And that is true in audiobooks as well. And additionally, making the choice as to whether you're going to go wide or go exclusive with Audible and then go wide, or, all these kinds of choices, and then how you're going to market the book and how you're going to set yourself up to be able to market the book are all important things to know. And so that's basically what I do my consulting on. Again, I don't recommend using a database of narrators, because what you've got in that database is people who have done no audiobooks up to bazillion audiobooks, right? But once someone has gotten past this point in their career, they're not paying attention to those databases. They're working with clients that they already have. They're working with major publishers. They're working with indie authors who they already know, and indie authors that are referred to them by other indie authors. So when you're looking for that narrator who is on the way up, they're gonna have a website. I will tell you 95% of the time, they're going to be able to give you a finished product. And the biggest tip I have for that too is you can be the producer in terms of paying the narrators. You can work directly with the Actors Union, which is the cheapest way to do it. But you don't have to be in charge of the actual production, hiring that proofer and that editor, because the narrators really want an editor that they trust, that knows them, in order to get their best performance. So either, like I said, they will have people that they work with, or they'll be able to refer you to a production company that they work with, or one or two, and then you can talk to them. Going on a database and putting your book up for auditions just gets you a slew of crap to deal with, honestly, not to be rude. But I really strongly recommend going the other direction. And people will say, oh, but you can't hire two narrators if you do that. You can't do royalty share if you do that. You can. You just have to, you get all your ducks in a row ahead of time, and then go into the process with the distributor.
Yes, I'm going to pop another question up, and then I swear I'll let Laura talk. Another question here, which you might not have the answer for, but just kind of what it would be a fair rate per hour per narrator, and like a good market rate. I suspect the answer is it completely depends on like multi-author, like length of book. Is that sort of fair to? Did I just answer my own question here?
Yeah, basically. I mean, one thing to know is that everyone in audiobook land is paid per finished hour. So they are paid for how long your book is when it's done, not how long it takes them to create the book. The exception would be if you have to pay a studio for some reason, like if you're recording your own book, but otherwise, because then you would have to pay studio time. But otherwise, you're paid by the finished hour. And there is a wide range of what that can cost. I can't really tell you, I can't tell you because it's an antitrust violation to give you a price, but you can go to SAG-AFTRA.org/audiobooks or something like that, and see what the minimum rates are. And they change every year, so I don't even want to quote that. It's unlikely that you're going to get someone who has some experience at the very bottom at that minimum rate, but you might get someone quite close to it. And the thing to know about the minimums is that sometimes they are for just the narration, and sometimes they're for the full production. And you want to be clear about that when you're negotiating with your narrator.
So with home cooked books, are you kind of helping people go through that whole process in some cases and providing guidance through that? So you kind of give people the option to have you come into whatever stage of production they're at. Is that what it is?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I'm a resource. You can book a 45-minute or an hour appointment, and I look at what you've got, and then I recommend what you need to do. Most of my consults are for marketing because people have been finding me once it's done. But I have talked to people who want to do audiobooks and they don't know what to do. So I have talked them through the process and made recommendations for their specific genre, and also in terms of release schedules, all those kinds of considerations. And again, so that they are then set up to market their books once they're released. Most people don't know that you can set a pre-order for an audiobook. And so they just put their books up and then it appears like the next day on Kobo, which is usually the case, and then like in 3 months on other distributors. So how do you market that if you have no date to work around? And the other thing is having assets to use that work for audiobooks that you wouldn't have to have for ebooks, things like that. There's a lot you can do sort of in the time while the narrator is recording to get yourself ready for that launch.
Okay, that's good to know. So basically authors can come to you whenever, if they're panicking at the beginning and they don't know what to do, they can come to you then, or if they just want help with marketing, they can talk to you about that. That's good to know.
I also have now, because there aren't a lot of new paid newsletters that advertise audiobooks. So I started one and it's quite small right now. But so right now, we just have about 400 some subscribers. You can get a free feature you can do an interview. Your narrator can do an interview. You can have a new release or a sale. And then I'm just asking that you share it with your fans in return while we're building the list. So that's like obviously it's free. It's the cheapest marketing option we offer. The other is the management of review copies, which I find most people do incorrectly. I'll just say it. They just do it wrong, because if you give out your valuable codes from Spotify or Audible or audiobooks.com, wherever they're coming from, because Kobo doesn't have them yet, as far as I know, then you don't know that you're going to get reviews on those. So my recommendation is to use BookFunnel or some service like that to give out your review copies, and then pick and choose who you're giving your valuable codes to for your retailer reviews. The good thing about Kobo is that people can just review without having to prove that they bought the book.
Yes.
Oh, and my other big suggestion when you're in the process of recording is about bonus material, reader magnets, and back matter. I think these are things people don't think of, but if you've got a bonus epilogue, I mean, I even forgot to do this with my books early on. Actually, my first books, I didn't know what a reader magnet was. So that was on me that way. But if you've got them, get the narrators to record them when they're recording the book. And then you can use them in newsletter swaps or as a way to get people to sign up for your newsletter through advertising. The other thing is to have back matter that works. And two things to think about are, one, there's no link. No one can press a button and get a link, and they're listening to it. So you obviously could put a link in your book description, but I find that the best thing to do is to have one thing place where they can find you that is easy to remember. For instance, I have at the back of my books, followkarengray.com. It's a URL that I own, and then that takes them to my landing page to sign up for the newsletter. The other thing is to use back matter, use teaser chapters. So have your narrator record just this simple line, keep listening for an example, for a chapter from another book by Karen Gray. And if you keep it that generic, you can swap those books out. Whatever book you want them to go to next, you can put a chapter in there before the book ends.
Lots of great advice coming through. We do have promo codes for audiobooks, but you just have to to send us an email and ask. It's not author facing, which is why it's maybe not as well known, but you just send us an email and we can make those.
Good to know. I'm glad I brought it up.
And we have some questions as we're kind of talking about the marketing side of things. So one sort of question here from Richard, which I'm kind of curious about as well. Any do's or do nots for audio samples or any audiobook covers? So do audio covers have to be just a different version of the ebook cover? Is that best practice? And how does an author best use the sample?
The cover should be professionally created. I mean, I know some authors are very good at creating covers, but it has to be a square. It has to be whatever the resolution is that the distributors require. But it should be recognizable as the same as your ebook cover, so no one gets confused that it's a different book. Same font, same color, same artwork. But it has to be arranged nicely to fit in a square instead of a vertical rectangle. It is not everyone does this, but I think it's smart to include the narrators on there because audiobook listeners, I find in my working with reviewers, they are much more willing to cross genres than people who only eye read. Ear readers, as I call them, will jump genres because of narrators. They will follow a narrator all over the place. So you want to have those narrators visible on the cover. As for the retail sample, it must be less than 5 minutes long. I highly recommend choosing a good meaty section. Don't just have someone choose it for you. And if you have multiple narrators, you want to represent both of them or all of them somehow. So even if you have to sort of stop and go into another one, I like it when you can sort of end of one chapter and the beginning of another chapter. Obviously, for your retail sample and for anything that you're going to use to post online, which I highly recommend, when you're working with your production company, if you don't feel savvy about editing audio, I do have a how-to on my website in my FAQs, how to create little samples to use on social media. Then you want to ask them first, like a very, very short, like a 10-second clip and a 1-minute clip so that you can put, or several 1-minute clips. Under 1 minute is a really good length for posting reels and on TikTok, things like that, using your cover and maybe some images, make a little video and have the narration be the sound instead of music like you would do for other videos. So when you're doing those, avoid anything that's gonna flag, that's gonna have your account cut down, like excessive language, things like that. I thought I make videos for other people, and for a while you could get away with a lot on TikTok because I think their bots weren't listening. They were only reading. But then suddenly they could hear it. They did something and they were monitoring it for the F words and the other words, and videos were getting flagged. So I don't do that anymore because I don't want people's accounts to get shut down. So you have to, if it's a sexy book, you want to make clear that it's a sexy book, but they can maybe just be kissing, things like that. And then no spoilers, but I think that would be obvious.
Yeah, the bots are just getting smarter than us all, so they'll soon take over. That's a really helpful piece that I hadn't even considered, that of course your sample should include both narrators. Yeah, that might be just such a miss to just do the beginning of your book to just
Hardly
have, like,
anybody does it, but I've had so many listeners say to me, "Oh, I wish both narrators were," because then I have to go looking for them in another book, and then they go away from your book, and they want to know that they are going to like both narrators unless they recognize them.
Yeah.
Because people are very particular about who is in their ears. It's such an intimate experience. So yeah.
Nice.
And it's a good call out too, how you said that readers for audiobooks really follow the narrator, because I've definitely heard that before, especially with romance. They kind of have their own fan club going. For sure.
Yes, but I think it's the means, and like my reviewers, I have like lists of what they will listen to, and many of them will listen to such a wide variety of genres. It's all about the performances for them. Whereas a lot of readers, they only want to read bully romances, and that's it. They won't go near anything else, you know.
I love the eye reader and the ear reader. That's great.
Yeah, I'm trying to spread that because
Love that.
you know.
It's because, like, especially I think it works because one of my favorite emojis is the eye emojis, you know? So it's when you say eye reader, I just imagine that, which is great. As we're talking about marketing, Laura has a question here and about what are the best ways to market audiobooks to Kobo listeners? And I wonder if you have any advice on this. And then maybe generally we can talk a little bit about kind of like a wide strategy for audiobooks and how this might differ in marketing.
Well, one thing I would say if you're marketing to a wide variety of retailers, I think you should include the major links in your advertising text, right? And you can include your audiobook links. And for instance, if you can, to me, the best way to target Kobo listeners and a handful of other retailers is through sales. And I don't know if you would agree that, but one, participating in promotions and then doing sales, and then either on social media or in advertising, sending the readers to those retailers, and not just in one country, but making sure that your links, either you're using an aggregator like Books to Read or a Genius link that then sends people to the correct country, or, and maybe you guys want to talk about this, using the links, make sure you have the links country by country. And like say you were doing a BookBub ad, you can add all those into the links that are available to the reader.
Sorry, hitting on mute. You can make a universal link with Kobo. The tip is so if you're looking at your book page on kobo.com, it'll default to kind of change to wherever you are. So for instance, me being in Canada and I'm viewing the store in English, you'll see a little thing that says CA-EN. If you delete that, that will make your link universal. And then anyone that opens it, they will get like the US EN or the FR store. So that's my little tip.
So yeah, so include that link everywhere that you are talking about the book. You can include the Kobo logos in your social media, and in your images, in the videos that you're making. I think also making sure you're opting into Kobo Plus, and then talking about that. I think another thing that people don't think about, and this was actually in the blog post you guys sent out to, no, that was a different thing. Penny Reed talks about talking about audiobooks in every newsletter. So saying things like, hey, like I have done several newsletters this spring talking about Kobo Plus. Did you know my books are in Kobo Plus? Did you know this is the deal? And you can go here and get it and then listen to all my audiobooks in 1 month for $7.99 or $14.99 or whatever it is. So I think the thing is that primarily everywhere that you're talking about your books, include your audiobooks and where they are. Don't let people just assume that Audible is audiobooks. They may be the Kleenex, but there's also Puffs, right? We got lots of different brands of tissue that we want to make sure people are.
We just call them tissues in Ireland. Kleenex isn't even a thing. So there you go. Like that's.
But you have to remind people in some areas.
That's a great point, because I feel like a lot of authors just focus on their ebook strategy and then just assume people will find the audiobooks if they want them. But it's good to remind readers that they actually exist and mention them on their own as well. That's a great tip.
On your newsletter, on your website, and again, you can have those logos. It just says, buy it on Kobo, buy it on, get it here. So you're making it easy for people. That's the thing. Think about making it easier for people to find your audiobooks where you want them to find them.
There's a question popped up that is specific for Kobo. I'm just going to pop up about the file upload size. It is on our to-do/wish list to increase this, yes, to be able to allow larger size. I think we currently cut it off at 100 megabytes, so don't have any solid date or anything in mind. But yes, that's on our radar to hopefully increase, because the box sets do so well on Kobo. We want to allow people to upload them as well in audiobook form. Just wanted to flag that. What do you think so you've sort of talked about, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but about releasing not necessarily at the same time. So should an audiobook always be considered like a brand new release? Like, how should an author really think about that?
It really depends on what kind of author you are. If you are someone who can write and release quickly, then I think it is advantageous to organize your schedule, your release schedule, to release the audiobook and the book at the same time, because that focuses the buyers on the fact that you're always going to have these things all together at once. And your audiobook is the most expensive thing. So if people are going to just buy one, you want them to buy the audiobook, right? Because that's the thing you're trying to make back the money on. Even with the print book, it's usually not quite as expensive. And I think you get a higher percentage depending on where the print book is being sold. So if you are releasing quickly, generally, I say do them all together. If you're like me and you're slow, then I find it, like I said, to have them ideally sort of placed in between your print ebook releases, so that it's a marketing event. Then if you're going to do that, you have to be clear with your review team. You might want to, if you have a review team, you might want to make sure you're dividing them up into segments. So you know who, like in my spreadsheet, I know of my review team who only wants the audiobook, who only wants the ebook, and who wants both. And a lot of them will review both. And what you can ask them to do is to go back and like edit their Goodreads or their BookBub review and just add a paragraph about the audiobook at the bottom. Speaking of which, you do want to make sure that if you're getting early reviewers or people reviewing your books, that they talk about the audiobook. Fortunately, and it's lovely if they forget that they're listening to an audiobook, because it's an experience, but you want that review to mention the performances, to hype up how good that experience was, because again, it's more expensive. People have to have a reason to buy that, to shell out that money, or to use their credit, or whatever, however they're paying for it. I think did I answer that question enough?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe a specific question here from Elaine. Should I do an audiobook for my 7th book, which is an anthology?
Like, I'm not sure if that is an anthology of your writing or if it's in an anthology of other people's writing. That's the question. I'm not sure. Oftentimes, having shorter things is not necessarily bad. It can be a good way. The Audiobook Publishers Association has done research, and people are more and more interested in shorter books, even though they don't want to waste a credit on it if they are in a subscription. But if it's like Kobo Plus, where it's an all-you-can-eat buffet, then it doesn't really matter. Or if it's elsewhere, you can price it really low, so it's an introduction into your world. You could also use it as a reader magnet, either occasionally or always. Other than that, if it's an anthology of your work, the only reason not to do it would be if the books exist in other places. you want to make sure you're not repeating them. Audible actually has a rule about this.
Oh,
A book can only be in one bundle.
oh, I didn't know that.
You can't cross them. So like in Kobo, you could have a box set that is like all the books, and then you can break it up and have a different box set, which is probably what most of us are doing because the audio will have to be shorter.
Mhm.
But you can't do that with Audible. You have to choose only one. So maybe that would be the other thing to keep in mind if you've got something in an anthology. But if it's something in an anthology with a bunch of other authors, I would say once the anthology is done and you get your rights back, yeah, do it as a, if you're going to release the ebook, especially, whatever you're going to do with the ebook from that anthology, do it with the audio. But here's one thing with recording short things. The SAG-AFTRA, there are minimums. So if something is only going to be under an hour, you have to pay a minimum of 1 finished hour. So, for instance, I had 3 shorts that had been reader magnets and it had been in anthologies. So I hired 2 narrators to record all 3 shorts because each one was under an hour, but together it was a nice little chunk of work for them. And I didn't have to pay, one person for an hour to record something that was 20 minutes long and a different person for an hour to record something that was 40 minutes long. That makes sense.
That is a top tip for the shorter content, for sure. We have gone over our hour here. That flew by, Karen. I could talk to you all day. It's like you were a narrator for several years with your wonderful voice.
It's like you're some kind of audiobooks expert, fairy godmother over here.
Oh, I forgot.
I know, you forgot the
word.
tiara.
It's the Q word.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to them. You can always send us an email at writinglife@kobo.com and we can try and answer them there. And Karen, thank you so much for your time. This has been so valuable, and I love being able to dive into something so specific with the audio. And you really are just such a wealth of knowledge.
Well, thanks for listening to me. I could talk all day, just not professionally anymore.
Thanks, Karen.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And we will see you next month for another chat. Have a wonderful rest of day. Bye.
I should